What comes to mind when you think of the words Hindi cinema? Vivid colors, extravagance? Because we really do have it all. From gritty morality to twisted innocence, an industry as layered as its stories, and music as heartwarming as it is entertaining. However, don't you feel like sometimes we lose sight of these things? Don't we start forming opinions about Hindi cinema based on the external factors? Because from what I know, that's just dust around the treasure chest. There are men and women who roam the streets of Mumbai every day wanting to be a part of that treasure chest, despite people saying they have unrealistic dreams. What the industry presents as reality isn't rigid, it's a translation of an individual's understanding of the world. It's a translation of how they want it to be. To begin with, I'm going to take you all the way back to the 21st of April, 1913. What's special about this day is that the first ever Hindi feature film was released. Raja Harish Chandra, directed and produced by Dada Saheb Phalke, fondly known as the father of Indian cinema. All it took for him to sow the seeds for a multi-billion-dollar industry was to watch a film. He watched a film called The Life of Christ. And that's it. That's how the Hindi film industry was conceived. However, Dada Saheb Phalke's contribution to Indian cinema doesn't end with its inception. He was also the first Indian filmmaker to cast a female lead in his Marathi film Mohini Bhasmasur. This doesn't seem like much now, but back then, acting was a taboo for women. And more than that, it was a taboo for any Indian woman to have any sense of freedom or independence. His career was truly one of firsts for the Hindi film industry. An important milestone in the history of Hindi cinema is one that surrounds itself with a lot of controversy. The establishment of the Cinematograph Act of 1918. They did this for the protection of the public from indecent or otherwise objectionable representations. This law defined itself with more distinction in 1920 when the censor boards came to Mumbai, Madras, Calcutta and Rangoon. Back then, censorship was used as a device of propaganda by the British. There were actually 43 objectionable subjects, of which 2 were primarily to secure the sanctity of the British Empire. Rule 21 and 22 objected to scenes holding up the king's uniform to contempt or ridicule, and subjects dealing with India in which British or Indian officers are seen in an odious light, respectively. From an objective point of view, it looks a lot like they didn't want films to portray abuse of power or police brutality, which were extremely real things back then. Cinema in India really bloomed after independence. We saw a number of realist films that came out in the parallel film movement. This was considered the golden age of Hindi cinema. One of the first Indian filmmakers to get inspired from the Italian neo-realistic movement was Bimal Roy. Do Bigha Zameen was a film he made under the influence of Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves. Do Bigha Zameen was a film that portrayed the exploitation of farmers and also shed light upon what leads the poor to a life of crime and a loss of morals. The theme of exploitation was one of relevance in the early years of independence. Mehboob Khan's Mother India also portrayed a greedy moneylender as the antagonist, much like Do Biga Zameen. These films are still considered the best of realist world cinema, and today's generation seems a tad bit ignorant of that. These films reflected a reality people were living. This gets me to a fact that is ignored by many. The fact that escapist films like Raj Kapoor's Shri 420 existed and thrived alongside realist films. The escapist films the Hindi film industry was making commanded respect and acclaim as well.
What is it that makes you love Hindi cinema?
I'll tell you. What I really enjoy about Hindi films is the whole package.
Hindi cinema has always been like for us Indians, it has been, like how cavemen used to listen to stories around a fire, and Hindi cinema has always been that. It has been a fire around which we've always crowded. That has been a way for us to connect with everybody else, with a larger culture of India.
You see, because we have inherited cinema's style, storytelling style, from a variety of long-standing narrative traditions, which included melodrama, a certain quality of intense emotionality, a certain vibrance in the way in which performances were done, expressed. There was music, dance, all this put together. We make sure that even in modern cinema, even with so-called genre-specific cinema, like you're making a murder mystery or a thriller or an actioner, these elements are naturally there.
I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that we missed something. Something so significant in Hindi cinema that you cannot possibly overlook. Sholay, one of the most iconic films in Hindi cinema, if not the most iconic. A film that kept an entire nation's eyes wide open for 3.5 hours and continues to do so. The director of this film, Mr. Ramesh Sippy, created emotional magic on screen with Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar's writing. A film that made the angry young man a permanent image in an audience's mind.
तुम लोग मुझे ढूंढ रहे हो और मैं तुम्हारा यहाँ इंतजार कर रहा हूँ.
Prakash Mehra's Zanjeer, written by the same iconic duo, created this aura for him. They created a version of masculinity for films released in the future. A version of masculinity that was rooted in an angst against the helplessness in the face of corruption. Yash Chopra's Diwar was another film that portrayed this angst the same year as Sholay. Salim Javed were pioneers of this movement. This built a model of longevity not only for Amitabh Bachchan but for upcoming films that could use these films as inspiration for newer and grittier content.
Would you say that realist films are perceived as better than escapist films?
So a lot of people feel that when you go into a theater, you have to forget about whatever your problems in lives are, and you're just embracing, just enjoying. And for this 2-3 hours, you are just transported into a magical kingdom where your problems have, just gone away. And the realist cinema talks about that, okay, this is where you actually find the problems. So there are two very different schools, and I think both are like very strong.
I am not so certain that I have fully agreed with the term escapist.
Yeah.
Escapist is generally taken to mean something that takes you out of your reality, okay, and into an imaginary world, the world of the story, and you get into it by forgetting your reality. I'm putting it to you, every cinema does that.
The 21st century. It's been culture shifting for both Hindi cinema and the consumers of it. We've delved into things that we would shy away from earlier, not just in terms of censorship, but in terms of experimenting with the tastes of crores of people. One of the films that defined the new wave of Hindi cinema was Farhan Akhtar's Dil Chahta Hai. This film was such that no matter what you think of the Hindi film industry in its entirety, you will enjoy it and you will relate to it. The national award-winning film was perfectly fit to match the taste of a wide audience. It's one of the earliest large-scale Hindi films exploring a millennial's lifestyle. Ashutosh Govarkar's Lagan came out in the same year, garnered critical appreciation and did well at the box office. Both these films were poles apart, and yet both of them are considered one of the most iconic films that the Hindi film industry has ever made. So we can get it out of the way that commercial Hindi films are low on substance, a rogue generalization. Cult cinema in India isn't just defined by grittiness. It's defined by the rigor with which it changes perspectives. One of the films that did this was Aamir Khan and Amol Gupte's Taare Zameen Par. This film was responsible for a paradigm shift with regard to the discussion of mental illnesses and disorders. This was a big budget film that discussed the struggles dyslexic kids go through only because of the stigma attached to the disorder. A parallel to this film was Sanjay Leela Bhansali's Black, one that explores the stigma surrounding visual and auditory impairments. This shows how the preconceived notions surrounding it increases a physical condition's limitations. This was a portrayal of the fact that there aren't only unfair stereotypes attached to mental health. These films, however, aren't the only ones that dare to delve into uncomfortable subjects or sensitive ones. There are just some films that treat realism differently. One of the most controversial films of this decade has been Abhishek Chaube's Udta Punjab, a film that holds no punches when talking about the drug problem amidst the youth of Punjab. This was one of the most talked about films when it released, not just for its subject, but for the movement it created with regard to censorship. Hindi cinema has been flush with cult films since the beginning of the 21st century. One of the most path-breaking cult films was Vishal Bhardwaj's Maqbool. What made this film such a phenomenon was that it wasn't just like any other Shakespearean Indian film. It took Macbeth and dipped its themes and its characterization into the setting of Mumbai. This was Vishal Bhardwaj's second film as a director, and a courageous second film at that. What was especially unique about Vishal Bhardwaj was that Maqbool was just the first of a Shakespearean trilogy he completed over a decade with Omkara and Haidar. One of the pioneers of cult Hindi cinema is undoubtedly Anurag Kashyap. One of his most ruthless films was Gulal. Released in 2009, a curious blend between politics and justice, this film leaves no stone unturned. What's unique about Anurag Kashyap's filmmaking is that even though all his films are a bite of life, their exaggeration comes from dystopia rather than it projecting a utopian side of the world. We see this in Devdi and the Gangs of Wasipur series as well. Devdi is a dystopian remixing of Devdas, one that portrays that a fragile ego and a heartbreak are two different things. Ego is a topic that Anurag Kashyap deals with even in the Gangs of Wasipur series. It shows how ego makes a poor man persist to turn himself into the criminal king of his town, and how the boons of that massage his ego just enough into making him create his own downfall himself. Over the years, his niche audience hasn't only grown in size, but has also grown to love the Indian grittiness in his films. This clout comes only from the confidence he has in paving his own way in a place that can get stagnant. Even on OTT platforms, Anurag Kashyap has been the flag bearer of directorial freedom. The full extent of creative liberation is largely exercised in Anurag Kashyap, Vikramaditya Motwane, and Neeraj Ghewon's Sacred Games. You see a show challenging religious beliefs and socio-economic classism and doing it with the utmost flamboyance. This is a Netflix series that keeps you hooked with its unique narrative structure. This challenges big screen censorship, not only by its goriness, but with its core vision itself. Again, This is a series that shows and chews into real problems and an actual status quo, but exaggerates it just enough to cast a hook into the audience's brain.
Ganesh Gaitunde.
One of the most talked about shows in the OTT space was Reema Kagti and Zoya Akhtar's Made in Heaven. This show explores ideas of classism, homophobia, and even abuse of power. In fact, each episode explored a range of topics from infidelity to dowry, all the way to blackmail. This was a show that thrived on social realism without missing out on any of the drama or entertainment you would find in an escapist Hindi film. Now, for the most unpredictable and exciting part of OTT platforms. Genres haven't been explored in Hindi cinema with this much freedom ever before. Anvita Dutt Guptan's Bulbul is a prime example of a film that is unorthodox in the face of traditional Hindi cinema. This was the case with Aarti Kadav's Cargo as well, which went even further into an unknown territory. This is put forth again with crime dramas like Karan Anshuman and Gurmeet Singh's Mirzapur or Neeraj Pandey's Special Ops. In fact, Mirzapur has literally become a cultural phenomenon in millennial India. Just like Sacred Games, Mirzapur offers the audience an ensemble cast, with each and every character representing a certain form of human nature. What's even more offbeat about Mirzapur is its ability to use a social undercurrent of misogyny as a narrative tool instead of preaching to an audience about it. It's clear that people are engaging with the content released on OTT platforms. This in turn means that audiences will expect more from any content they watch, whether it's on OTT or not. However, that isn't the real question. The real question is, are the new governmental regulations on OTT platforms going to curb the creative liberation filmmakers currently have on this medium? And if that's the case, will this mean that the content will become less engaging and regress in terms of exploration?
What do you think about the governmental regulations on OTT platforms right now?
I always believe in rating. I don't believe in regulating, because really, there's so much content everywhere, like, on YouTube, you can just type any web address and go anywhere. So if someone wants to seek something, right, they'll get it. They will. So I don't believe in those kind of regulations, because the regulating committee is made up of humans who are fallible. You can't assume that they are, their decisions is decision of God. At least art should be free from that.
OTT has been seen as certainly a very comforting, new phenomenon and new avenue for storytelling for filmmakers. And yet, it's not that the OTT people do not have their considerations. There is less fear, but there is fear there because you're operating here. In a country like this, your headquarters are here. So I'm afraid when you have a society and a state which is scared of free thought, which is scared of free expression, which is scared of artists and writers, they will try every means possible and block every avenue where any kind of free expression is likely to flourish, like was happening with OTT platforms.